Good morning. Welcome back to the forum for the continuation of our program this morning. We will, following this event, the speech which will be introduced in just a moment, we'll have our concluding event, the debate between the chairs of the parties. We have still a full schedule to go before you're released across the river for the football game. But we're delighted to see so many of you back and in the sessions this morning, and I hope they were fulfilling sessions for you. To introduce our speaker this morning, I would like to introduce to you the acting dean of the Kennedy School, who's been an awfully good supporter of our Institute of Politics since I have been here, and he is going to introduce our speaker. Please welcome the acting dean of the Kennedy School, Al Carnesale.
Before I start my introduction, I have the privilege of introducing somebody else that's with us today, also a strong supporter of the Kennedy School and the Institute of Politics, the new president of Harvard University, President Neil Rudenstein. Well, on behalf of the students, the staff, and the faculty of the John F. Kennedy School of Government, all of whom benefit enormously from the Institute of Politics, welcome. The Kennedy School would not be the exciting place that it is, nor could it become the Kennedy School that we hope and know it will be, if we in the IOP were not part of the same family. Not long ago, columnist George Will observed, and I quote, "In the 1940s, a survey listed the top 7 discipline problems in public schools: talking, chewing gum, making noise, running in halls, getting out of turn in line, wearing improper clothes, and not putting paper in wastebaskets." A 1980s survey lists these top 7: drug abuse, alcohol abuse, pregnancy, suicide, rape, robbery, assault, arson, and venereal disease are also RANs. Close quote. What a change. In just 40 years, our children's problems at school have grown from talking and chewing gum to abusing drugs and alcohol. How sad. How can our education system be revived? This is not simply a problem of pedagogy. It is not merely a question of choosing the right textbook or putting prospective teachers through the right college curriculum. This is largely a political problem. Its solution lies in articulating ideas in public debate, in making public policy, in persuading the public of the right course of action, and in marshaling scarce public resources. Our featured speaker this morning has dedicated his career to solving the problems of public education. As a governor, as a leading voice in the Republican Party, as a university president, as now as United States Secretary of Education. This community first came to know Lamar Alexander in 1971 when he was a fellow in the Institute of Politics. As governor of Tennessee in the early 1980s, he became known for his Better Schools program. The cornerstone of that plan was rewarding outstanding teachers with additional recognition and additional pay. In 1988, the Education Commission of the states gave him its most prestigious award for, quote, distinguished national leadership in education, close quote. That award was named after James Bryan Conant, a former president of this university. After stepping down from the governorship and recuperating in Australia, he became president of the University of Tennessee. In January 1991, President Bush nominated him to be U.S. Secretary of Education, and he was unanimously confirmed by the Senate. This is an academic institution, so I should note our speaker is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Vanderbilt University and a former law review editor at New York University. I'm pleased to present to you the United States Secretary of Education, Lamar Alexander.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Al, and President Rudenstein, Senator Kennedy. Nice to see you. Ted is my boss. He's chair of the committee, so I work for him, and I'm glad to see him. When I was governor, I was on the Today Show with Chet Atkins, who plays the guitar. They had us on at one time, and Jane Pauley asked Chet a whole number of questions about what was going on in Russia and asked me to play the piano, which we both thought was kind of odd. And so I'm spending all my time thinking about education these days, and I've been asked to speak about what's going to happen in politics over the next 25 years, which I haven't given a thought to. But I welcome the opportunity to give a few thoughts to that, and that's what I'm going to try to talk about a little bit, and it might touch education just a little bit. When I was in Australia with our family, I learned the Australians have a succinctness about them. For example, they described the difference between William Winter. We were governors together, and now we're not elected to anything anymore. They would say the difference between what we were and what we now are is rooster today, feather duster tomorrow. And over the years, as I've come back to the Institute of Politics, it has sometimes looked to me like sort of an institute for feather dusters, hoping for reincarnation. Not always, but sometimes. I'm glad to see the new president of Harvard. The president of Harvard has always had a major role in American education, and all the jobs I've had, it's been the most hazardous, even including the one I now have. The first day I was president of the University of Tennessee, a faculty member came up and said, "Well, you're so enthusiastic. You remind me of Clark Kerr." And I said, "Well, how nice." He was the distinguished president of the University of California, of course. I said, "How is that?" And the faculty member said, "You know, he arrived and left the same way, fired with enthusiasm." So I have had more contact with the Kennedy family and with the Kennedy Institute than a Republican might normally be expected to have. I was a part of the Kennedy Institute's first affirmative action program. Don Price found me in the mountains of Tennessee, and I was the first Southern hillbilly Republican ever to be brought to be a fellow here. And I was grateful to that, and it was a wonderful experience. It was in 1971. But while I was in law school at New York University, I was lucky enough in the summer to work for Bobby Kennedy when he was the Attorney General. There was a big dog named Brumus that wandered around the Justice Department halls. The Attorney General rode around. I think it was in a yellow convertible, if I remember right. It was sort of the coat over the shoulder days in Washington. People were having a great fun. Even a little bit of naughtiness was okay. That was fun too for everybody, and the country didn't seem to suffer too much for that. I think summer of '73 was the year of the March on Washington, and at least I remember, and I think it must have been that summer, and that great mob of people hearing Martin Luther King's speech. I had a dream, and it was a time of learning practical politics too, because after that enlightening experience, I went back down to Chattanooga, graduated from law school at NYU, and went back to Chattanooga, applied for a job as an assistant United States attorney, and I was asked what my party affiliation was. I told them, and they said that probably wouldn't do. I had to admit I was a Union Republican from a county that still called Democrats rebels. In 1967, I was in Washington because Howard Baker was elected to the Senate. It was even more of a coat thrown over the shoulder time. Even the Republicans were having some fun with government, which is a rare thing, really. Everett Dirksen was in full bloom. I remember he had those thick-rimmed glasses without glass in them. I don't know if you knew that. He thought they made him look better. He was basking in the fact that President Kennedy had called him back in the early 60s in the middle of the campaign, ensuring his reelection. He was making speeches about marigolds. He was one of the few who could say to reporters who would ask tough questions that he didn't want to answer, he would just say, "You don't say." It was when the difference between Hubert Humphrey and Mike Mansfield was measured in terms of the number of questions they were asked on Meet the Press. It was always about 2 questions for Hubert Humphrey. That was, he could fill up 30 minutes answering 2 questions, and for Senator Mansfield it was 40 or 45 questions. He would always say, yep, no, something like that. And one of my most exciting times was 2 of the youngest senators, Howard Baker and Ted Kennedy, got together and took on 2 of the revered members of the Senate, Everett Dirksen and Sam Ervin, on the issue of reapportionment, and beat them. And it was a big thing, and all of us younger staff aides thought we were important too, just for having been around it. And now I find myself back in Washington, and who was chairman of the committee to which I report but Senator Ted Kennedy. So for a Tennessee Republican, I've been involved with, appreciated, and have admired the influence of the Kennedy family on American politics, American government. It got a lot of us excited, people my age, got us interested in politics and government of whatever party. Now, for the next 25 years, and I'm going to be so speedy about this that you may think I haven't thought all these thoughts through, which is correct. But I'm going to give you, from 2 perspectives, some thoughts about the next 25 years in politics. First, what would be some of the characteristics? I think local, more local. Tip O'Neill would probably say it's always local, but more local. Except for war, welfare, social security, debt, and sometimes the environment, the most satisfying political answers are community answers. We're going to come to realize that more. More domestic issues. Not just domestic in terms of defining a domestic agenda by how many federal laws are passed, but defining a domestic agenda in terms of the kind of questions that Václav Havel asked in Czechoslovakia of Czechoslovakians. What kind of place is this? What is important to us? What do we have to contribute? I think we'll become, in the next 25 years, once again fascinated about what is this idea we call America. More involvement by women. I think that's inevitable because women are underrepresented. I think it's also part of the American way. You know, in our politics, for no good reason we enjoy, even though we might enjoy vanilla, we'll change to strawberry. We'll change flavors, and I think we'll see more women involved in politics. And I think another reason is because too many of us men in politics, whenever we make speeches, always get a different voice on. Have you ever noticed that? A lot of the men start sounding like they're radio announcers as soon as they start pronouncing about politics, and then they go back to normal when they're not. And I think they're going to vote a lot of us out just for that reason and put women in. And then the women will make the same mistake and get overly officious, and men will make a comeback. That's the American way. More authentic people in government. It is fascinating to me because I've been out of politics, in and out of it, even at a distance. When we lived in Australia for 6 months, I refused to read an American newspaper for 6 months. Got used to it. But have you noticed how often it's the media interviewing each other, and consultants and pollsters interviewing each other, even interviewing the media, and elected people reading press releases written by people who just graduated from college? And who really cares what all those unelected people think? I don't think most voters do. And it's not very much of a democracy if unelected people have that much sway. I remember in 1967, I was writing speeches for Howard Baker in his first year as senator. I wrote great speeches. I gave them to him, and off he went. And then I went to hear him. He didn't say a word I wrote. So I went to see him privately, and I said, Senator Baker, we have a problem with our relationship. I write these great speeches, and you haven't been giving a word of them. He looked me squarely in the eye and said, Lamar, he said, we have no problem at all. I said, our relationship is perfect. You just keep writing what you want to write, and I'll keep saying what I want to say, and we'll get along fine. Communications will become even more important. It's hard for me. I think I'm going to get up in the middle of the night and walk into the next room, and there will be C-SPAN. It's always everywhere. I think it's here today. And it'll be hard in the MTV generation for people in public life not to be able to communicate the nature of the issues will be such that communication and persuasion will be awfully important. Another characteristic, movement politics. Political leadership will be more reminiscent of political leaders like Gandhi or Martin Luther King or Abraham Lincoln for the issues and the times of the next 25 years. And then finally, coalitions. People saying all together now, let's get together and see if we can do something about this or do something about that. I think that's going to be a big part of the politics of the next 25 years. Now let's look at it a little different way. And I may get in deep trouble for saying this. I've already asked Senator Kennedy if I could have immunity of some sort, because I'll have to mention Congress in all of this, and he's assured me that I'll be fine. But let me start with the presidency. I think inevitably the presidency will become more important over the next 25 years. To be president will be an even more unfathomable thing for someone to consider. And I guess we'll still have people who want to do it. But getting to be president will become even more of a sort of political Star Wars. The campaigns, I mean. And the only people who will be willing to run for president or successful will be those who are able to sort of devote their lives to a form of political priesthood. Because not only do you give up your life after you get in terms of any sort of normality, but apparently you're now expected to have given it up for the whole period of time since you were 6 in order to prepare yourself for the presidency. And there will be a certain number of people willing to do that and a large number who won't. And that will affect the quality of the candidates and the number of people who run for what will become a more interesting and more exciting and more difficult job, I think. This is a contest now for the presidency, and will become more so, it looks, unless we reverse it somehow, where the major objective, where we kill the losers, or at least turn their pictures around on the wall so that we don't remember who they were, even though they were considered to be very decent people before they ran for the presidency, and we even permanently wound most of those who succeed. The issues of the presidency will be the same issues that they always were, peace and prosperity, but peace will be more important. And the following television image will be the kind of image that voters will look for and respond to most, probably in the next election and probably in the next several elections. You wake up from a night's sleep, turn on the television, and there, sort of emerging and gathering out of the shadows, are the President and Jim Baker and Dick Cheney and Colin Powell explaining to you what happened where in the world the night before that wasn't expected to happen and what they're doing about it. And the confidence that the voter has in whatever team that is at the time will be probably the President of the United States, the presidential team. There will be a second function to the presidency in the next 25 years that I suspect will be better defined. And the opportunity exists, I think, for people of either party. And that will be the job of setting the domestic agenda on a few urgent issues and making things happen. George Reedy wrote in The Twilight of the Presidency that aside from the commander-in-chief responsibilities, that the president should, number one, see a few urgent needs, number two, divine a strategy to meet them, and number three, persuade at least half the people of the rightness of the policy. That's more than being a bully, using the presidency as a bully pulpit. It's what the president is attempting to do with America 2000, the education strategy, to help touch a feeling, a growing attitude across the country and move things in a direction. And third, I think there will be, again, a greater role for the president. I guess there always has been, but maybe it's more important in the next 25 years, of symbolizing what we are as a nation. The president is the great teacher, maybe even educating himself or herself in public in that process and helping us understand ourselves. Now, here's the part where I may get in trouble: Congress. I'll say this gently. I think that what Congress should do, I really do think this. I think that Congress should go home in June and July. That it is becoming increasingly irrelevant and is getting in trouble and losing respect because it is making up things to do that don't really need to be done. Congress has 40,000 staff members, 40,000 staff members to do what I can't imagine. Well, I can't imagine some of it because I'm there. But to give you an example, last week I spent 2.5 hours testifying before the House Education Committee, who had discovered that the President had actually made a speech to school children on television and the Department of Education had paid $26,000 to help pay for it. One of the members of the committee asked the House historian to see if he could find a time in the history of Congress when there had been so trivial an investigation, and they're still researching the subject. But the point of the matter is, I'm not sure that's the best use of time for so many members of an important committee, for the General Accounting Office, for the Secretary of Education, for a lot of departmental people, when there's so many other things to do in this country and in education. I suspect we'll see term limits in the next 25 years. We have them for the President. We have them for governors. We probably have them for Congress, and I think there's a good chance that one of the developments will be that the new breed of members of Congress will decide that Congress might do less because the foreign policy issues are more left to the President and the domestic issues are more left to communities and governors, and the Congress, by the end of 25 years, will become an increasingly respected forum, doing less, doing fewer things, and meeting for a shorter period of time. And then the last players, the action at home. The most fun will be at home, where the governors and the mayors and local movement leaders are. Those are the best jobs in politics for the next 25 years. The governor's a better job than the president because you don't have to enter the political priesthood quite so much, give up the rest of your life. By movement leader, I mean like Jimmy Carter. He called me last Friday. I was in Atlanta. He said he just wanted me to know that he was going to enter something, try to do something that was fraught with a lot of potential for highly publicized failure. But he was going to try to solve the problems of Atlanta's poor. Now, that is such an ambitious thing to do that you wonder about it for a minute. But on the other hand, that's just a very good thing for him to do. And I and Jack Kemp and Lou Sullivan and others of us in the administration ought to work with him. And he probably can do a great deal about that, mobilizing people to do things in their hometown for people who need help. Ted Fisk, who was the New York Times education reporter, visited us this week. We see the emerging education movement a lot like the civil rights movement, people coming to a judgment across this country about the importance of education and the job of leadership to touch each community and try to help it move out. I wish you could be with me at Metro Richmond 2000 or Las Cruces 2000, where just by suggesting the importance of America 2000 in a framework, a dean of a college of arts and science will get a steering committee of 89 people in Las Cruces and divide up in 6 teams, each of them in support of one of the 6 national education goals, and off they go. Those are communities that it'll be much easier for the Congress and for the governors and for the rest of us to help. That's the kind of action for the future. Sort of the collective unconscious forming itself out there, and political leadership then has to do with shaping those attitudes and accelerating that thought, as with the civil rights movement, as with recycling in the 80s, as with reducing the demand for drugs in the 80s, as with America 2000. And the skills will be agenda setting and coalition forming. In 1982, I was re-elected governor, and I thought about what I could do in the last 4 years. One thing was a better schools program. The other thing was something called Tennessee Homecoming 86. Well, I talked about it in my inaugural address. Tennessee Homecoming 86 got one line of attention. I explained it to some members of the legislature, and one of them literally went to sleep during my explanation. I ask every Tennessee community to do 3 things. Look at its roots, find something to celebrate, and invite everybody who ever lived there home to help celebrate that in 1986. By 1986, there were 3,000 celebrations in that year, whether it was Minnie Pearl's Grinders Switch or in Knoxville and Forest Brook community, where they invited everybody to come home on July the 4th and who'd ever lived in Forest Brook, and they sat in their old kitchens and rocked in their yards and on their porches and compared notes with where the children had grown up and thought about what was important to them and how they would lead their lives and what kind of country this would be. I suspect that the politics of the next 25 years, that sometime during that time there will be a new American homecoming, something like that Tennessee homecoming, where we look at those questions, like what kind of place is this? What is important to us? What do we have to contribute to each other and to the world? And I think that will be where the political action will be and ought to be. Thank you.
Secretary Alexander has agreed to take some questions, though we're on a tight schedule. We have some unscreened questions from members of the Student Advisory Committee, so we'll start here.
Thank you. I wanted to ask the Secretary a question about school choice, because as you are aware, many of us fear that the private sector will increase the disparities among suburban and inner city and rural schools. I wondered what steps you would take to ensure that school choice achieves an equality of educational opportunity rather than widen the disparity between wealthy and low-income students.
Well, one way to take those steps is to do it step by step in terms of if private institutions are going to be included, as we think they should be. We think people without money ought to have some of the same choices people with money have, that take it step by step and see if that indeed happens. I think what is more likely to happen is that private schools may take kids in trouble, or the contracts could be made with private schools to do that. Or there won't be a problem at all. You know, we've had widespread choice in higher education. Senator Kennedy and others have made sure that over the last 25 years that the Pell Grants and federal grants and loans are now available to 1 out of every 2 college students, and you can spend your GI Bill at Harvard, or you can spend it at Boston College, you can spend it at Notre Dame or at Jewish Theological Seminary. The end result of that is, even today, 80% of students go to public institutions, and somehow or another we've ended up with one of the best systems, probably the best system of higher education in the world. So with private choices, step by step, with public choice among public schools, I don't see any need to wait much longer.
I've been informed the names of the students that had the prepared question were Evan Stone. Evan Stone? Am I right? Yes, please, go ahead.
Secretary Alexander, I have to pay extremely high fees to come to Harvard.
Yeah. But you don't have to go to Harvard.
That's true. A few years ago, Secretary Bennett delivered sort of a ringing denunciation of higher education in this regard. Can you comment on fees and what we could do in the future to reduce them?
Well, the reason you pay high fees at Harvard is because although you don't feel like it, you can afford to pay them. And if you can't, Harvard will try to help you pay them. One of the puzzles to me in American life is that virtually everybody thinks they can't afford to go to college, yet we have this enormously generous situation. I was president of the University of Tennessee. As with most public institutions, the tuition there is $2,000 or less a year. To start with, 70% of the cost of going to the University of Tennessee is paid for by the state taxpayers, and then on top of that, half of the students there have a federal grant or a federal loan. 80% of the students in America in college go to public institutions. Almost all of the tuitions there are $2,000 or less a year. In the elite private institutions like Harvard, it's gotten more expensive. We count on these institutions to do a lot of different things, including be important research universities, and that's where the cost goes way up. I don't know the solution to that. I'd like for that cost to go down. I look at Vanderbilt, where I went, a private university, and I have a feeling that there were a lot more middle-income students like me there in the 1960s than are able to go there in the 1990s. That bothers me because there are a lot of southern small-town boys and girls who got to go to Vanderbilt during that period of time, and I get the impression it's a little bit more of an elite group today. I think that's a problem for Vanderbilt, but I think, generally speaking, that we have in this country an enormously generous system of support for students who want to go to college, and while it's not easy for anybody, and we ought to continue to try to make improvements in it, that I don't plan to make a big speech here today criticizing colleges for their fees and tuitions.
See, the other two, as I understand, students are Evan Grayer and Adam Smith. Is that correct? If you could get to the microphone.
Mr. Secretary, If indeed the choice program, as was suggested by a previous questioner, leads to the resegregation of American schools, do you see any increased role for the federal government in future years in alleviating that situation?
Well, thank you for the question. I think the choice program just cannot be permitted to lead to by itself to lead to an increased resegregation of American schools. The law applies to choice programs just as well as it does to non-choice programs. But I know that in Memphis, for example, where the school system is largely black, the black school superintendent, the NAACP in court, agreed about 10 years ago to gradually give parents a choice of schools there. Now about 45 of their schools are in the program. It's actually reduced the amount of crosstown busing, and they put $2 million into academic programs that they saved. So none of the choice programs I know of are designed or really can, under the way the law is, lead to more segregation.
Well, what I'm referring to is not only racial segregation, but also economic segregation.
Well, I think it would work the reverse, because the person who has choice now is someone with money. First thing they do is move to the part of town where the school is that they choose, or choose a private school. The person who doesn't have choice is the single mother making $10,000 whose kid is stuck in a remedial reading program she thinks isn't good for the kid, and she doesn't have the money to move. She can't afford a private school. So if that person had more choices, I would think the chance would be greater that it would not lead to economic segregation. If it should create classes of schools, then I would think the school board would try to change that. That wouldn't be healthy.
Thank you.
We'll only have time for two more questions. This one and one over here.
Mr. Secretary, yesterday we heard a speech from Ted Sorensen. He spoke about morals and good politicians. Today you spoke about politicians being authentic. Don't you see a problem with people like that wanting to go into politics, having to spend their whole time campaigning or appealing to their constituency? How are people going to politicians like that going to be attracted to the next 25 years?
Well, I never minded campaigning, and in fact I enjoy it. I walked all the way across the state to be the governor of Tennessee and met 1,000 people a day and stayed in the nights at nights I stayed with people along the way, and I felt like that was the best education I have to be the governor. That I don't mind. I think what will discourage people these days is this incessant dwelling on your entire life to see if you can be destroyed based on one error in judgment or one mistake. Now that will cause a great many good people to say, I'm not going to subject myself or family to that. There are not many priests who are available for public life, and all of us try to do the right thing. None of us is perfect, and I think we need to be more balanced than that in our as we examine people's. The inquiry is not, are these people fit to serve? The inquiry is, let's see if we can destroy them. That's not good, whether it's a man or a woman or a Republican or a Democrat.
What's the answer to that, though? Is it campaign reform?
Campaign what?
Reform?
No, there's probably not a law you can pass about that. It has to be, like most things, a change in attitude on the American people, a more balanced view of politics and people. And I suspect, since it is common sense, that it will happen. People will have to show some restraint and some good judgment, and people will finally say, we don't want to hear any more about that. And the media will have to say, our job, we want to leave some line of separation between our daily family newspaper publication and the National Enquirer. That would be a nice line to draw, and it's not always easy to do.
Thank you, Al. My question is about bipartisanship and the future role of the Congress. You mentioned Everett Dirksen. In his day, there was a lot of discussion about the need for a bipartisan foreign policy. Not much about that on the domestic side. Today, it seems to me the situation is reversed. The American people understand that we need a president who engages foreign issues effectively, and we're pretty willing to follow him. But on the domestic side, many of the issues that trouble America, drugs, homelessness, even education, don't have four-year solutions. They're going to take 12, 15, 18, 20 years to solve. It seems to me there's a role for partisan leadership to set the agenda and mobilize people's confidence around a leader on these issues, but the solutions are going to have to be bipartisan. That leads me to the role of the Congress. It seems to me that the Congress is almost the only institution we have where the struggle for bipartisanship is played out. And it looks to me like the Civil Rights Bill, on which Senator Kennedy and President Bush seem now to have found common ground, is a good example of something that served America's purposes. Think how much worse it would be if we went into the next campaign with the whole campaign about why we didn't have a Civil Rights Bill.
Well, Lewis, and I should really asking Louis Brand some questions. I've always thought he's one of the wisest people who I know. Here, I want to be frank with you about, and maybe I can learn something from Senator Kennedy on this, because here I am, the Secretary of Education. He's Chairman of the Education. We ought to be able to work, and we have in some occasions, on trying to be bipartisan about the approach toward education. He, for example, introduced at our request the administration's America 2000 legislation. That doesn't mean he supports it. It just means we were going to see if we could work it out. But Washington is such a highly charged place politically. I would let the senator tell you how bipartisan he thinks the Civil Rights Bill was. It looked to me like a pretty big brawl right down to the end with a result that two people agreed on. Now, as governor, that's not the kind of bipartisanship that I worked on. I find it much easier to work state by state. I mean, in Georgia, Zell Miller, the Democratic governor of Georgia, kicks off Georgia 2000, calls on every community to do it. In Oklahoma, in Colorado, Governor Roy Romer, the chairman of the Democratic Governors Association, whose job it is to elect Democrats, is the first governor to pick up on America 2000. There are more Democratic governors doing it than Republican governors so far. Yesterday I was with my own governor, Ned McWhorter, a Democrat in our home state, the same thing. It's easier to work in a bipartisan way in the states than it is in Washington, at least in my experience. Now, it may be that I'm too new to know how to do it, but I see that the whole town is poised looking for a fight. Not necessarily the Congress, just all the other people around who seem to prefer one and benefit from one, and that makes it more difficult. I don't know the solution to it, but in the areas where Congress does have domestic agenda responsibilities, and education certainly ought to be one of those, we ought to move it outside the political arena, and as much as we can, I'd sure like to do that, and I know that the President would. Thank you.
First, let me mention that the next session will start in 10 minutes. We'll take a 10-minute break, but now I know all of us want to thank the Secretary of Education, Lamar Alexander, for being with us here today.